Nice. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. You can do that. Slide this out of the way. How many people have seen me give a talk before? All right, so for those that haven't, hi, my name's Sean. I'm gonna tell you a bit about myself in a second. I'm very spastic, I run around a lot. And yeah, today I'm gonna talk about some hybrid app development work that I've done. And before I do that, this is my obligatory, I literally put this in every slide presentation I do because I hate PowerPoint. I think it's from the 9th layer of hell. But if nothing else, you will get to see this awesome work of art that has also adorned many metal albums. The artist is Gustav Doré. It's a picture of Satan from Milton's Paradise Lost. So if you take nothing else from this entire presentation, you got a little art culture. And now you know who Gustav Doré is. And you should also just go read Paradise Lost because it's kind of rad. So who am I? So I graduated from UGA. I used to work here, actually right across the hall. I worked on the first version of Mouse Dining and the 1.5 version of Gadget Scouter. So I was over there with Brandon's team. I used to work in this building. About a year and a half ago, I left to go work in Atlanta. Ironically, after giving a talk about not leaving to go work in Atlanta, life circumstances change. So started working in Atlanta a year and a half ago, sold my house and moved to Atlanta a year ago, been down there since. Happy to come back here. Thank you guys for having me. Thank you, Vlad. If you're on the Developers of Athens Slack channel, you've seen me on there. I have the cat picture. So currently I'm a senior web developer at a company called CoDesign. We have a product called Intranet Pro. It makes SharePoint suck less. I've been there for about 6 months. Basically what we do is we build JavaScript single page applications that sit on top of the SharePoint framework and the Office 365 framework and try to make that usable for large enterprise clients. We have clients like Louisiana State LSU, Louisiana State University, Cox, the giant cable company. So kind of big enterprisey people that actually make you read these things. Related, I also do some contract work with Hearst Autos. They publish carandriver.com, roadandtrack.com. They're a small division of Hearst Publishing. And so that was my first experience in dealing with intranets, is that Hearst is one of those giant companies that has this intranet that they make you read for everything. And it's obnoxious and cumbersome and unmanageable. So now it's fun to be working with a small company again, but that makes a product that makes those intranets suck less. I also, up until very recently, I was a JavaScript instructor at Creative Circus. I also used to teach here in Athens when I was a member over, well, I'm still a member, but when I was actively involved with For Athens, I was the director of education. So working with Jordan Burke over there, helping to do some teaching. Took some of that to Atlanta and taught JavaScript, intermediate and advanced JavaScript, just plain vanilla JavaScript to primarily design students. So we weren't doing a lot of heavy lifting. They weren't doing any single page application stuff. It was a lot of DOM manipulation, how do I move data back and forth, that kind of stuff. I do some freelance consultant work through my own company, Torch Code Lab, and I am a JavaScript generalist, which leads into what I am not. I am not a JavaScript expert, and I'm also not claiming to be an Ionic expert. This talk is about my experience in building this application that I recently shipped that was done using the Ionic framework. Ionic is based on TypeScript and Angular 4 currently. And I played around with, well, let's just get into it. Let's talk about, so I'm that guy. That's not my super professional picture. Professional. Fun fact, that's actually taken down at Epcot at Disneyland, Disney World rather. And so that, I think it's great that my professional picture is me watching fireworks. But I'm also this guy. If you follow me online at all, I use the nom de plume Rad Ranger because I'm a giant Power Rangers fan. Lifelong metalhead. I have really bad social skills and even worse PowerPoint skills, as you can tell. And every now and then you'll catch me where I'm covered from red and head to toe with my Power Ranger sword, because what else would a 42-year-old man do on a Saturday in Atlanta? So my career timeline, I started off just doing HTML, then CSS came along and I did some of that. Got tired of rewriting the same stuff over and over, so then I moved into PHP. PHP was neat, writing a lot of back-end stuff, but I like the front end. I like doing some of the design work, but I'm not 100% a designer. I don't know color theory. I don't know type scales. I don't know that kind of stuff. But I like building interfaces. So I ended up leaning more front end. Eventually jQuery came along and it made JavaScript not suck. And so I started doing a lot of jQuery. So you can see the bulk of the timeline was spent with jQuery. I worked at a marketing agency. We did mostly content management system websites. So I wasn't doing a lot of heavy lifting, just fun interface things, building interesting UIs to get people to click through things. We wrote applications that would get you to click like buttons on Facebook pages so Facebook could crawl all your data. They've been doing that since 2012. That's not new. So all the stuff that's in the news now, yeah, that's been happening for a while. And I wrote some of those. That was neat. Eventually, I left that. I left the agency world, got out of marketing and wanted to get more into product development. When I did that, I kind of landed here. One of the icons that I actually left off, the first versions of mouse signing and, like I said, 1.5 of Gadget Scouter were written in Backbone.js. That was my first experience with a single page application framework. It was good. I enjoyed it. Backbone you don't hear about anymore. It doesn't get used quite as often. It's still pretty stable. It's out there. It doesn't do a lot of the things that these newer frameworks do, and clearly I forgot about it because I didn't even put it up here. More recently, I have been working in Vue.js. The work that I'm doing with Hearst Autos, I'm building a pattern library for them to use, a style guide, and we're building that in 100% Vue.js. Eventually, the car and driver website, which is currently partially Angular, partially Vue.js, will be 100% Vue.js using static site generation. I did some work with Angular 1.5. I don't ever want to touch that again. Angular 2 and 4 are much better. Angular 1, yuck. Currently writing apps in React. I have shipped one that's really ugly, and I can't wait to go back and refactor at CodeDesign, doing some analytics data for Internet Pro users. So when someone from Cox publishes something, they know how many people in the organization actually went and read it and interacted with it. And then we're working on another one that is doing TalkBox integration. We're building in video conferencing directly into SharePoint using the TalkBox API, which is a video conferencing API. That's all written in React. And then on the side, I just recently worked for Ticket Alternative and FreshTix, and we built an application for them in Ionic. Ionic is, like I said, it's Angular 3, Angular 4, and TypeScript. We'll touch on this more in the end, but they're actually moving away from even being married to any particular library. So you kind of think of Ionic as its own thing. If you pick it up today and you go out and grab one of their starter kits, what you're going to get out of the box will be Angular by default, and it'll be Angular 4 and TypeScript by default. I think they're going to keep TypeScript when they move into the next version. So Ticket Alternative is a company that's kind of competing with Ticketmaster, and thank God, because Ticketmaster sucks. There goes any chance of ever working with Ticketmaster. If they ever see this on YouTube, which, you know, those 20s of views that I get is not likely to happen. They have an application called FreshTix. FreshTix says, we're going to help you create an event. We're going to handle printing the tickets. We're going to help you sell the tickets. We're going to create a website for that. And we're also going to give you an application that you can install to scan those tickets when people come to your event. So they have, my slides are out of order. So they set up for events like this, big old festivals. And they use devices like that, the iPod Touch. And we built it with that. So what they have in the App Store currently is this application. They just updated to the one that we built. And so it's built using Ionic 4, the newest updated version of Ionic. And what it does is I have an event. I am selling tickets to that event, or I'm giving tickets away to that event. You go online, you say, okay, cool, I want to go to this thing, I'm going to buy these tickets. FreshTix has that platform to handle all of that. Then, if I'm a venue owner, say I run the 40 watt, I'm going to give the person working the door, either I'm going to let them install the app on their device, or I'm going to hand them, in most cases, hand them an iPod Touch, because those are really cheap, that is running this application. I log into the application, I say you can scan these types of tickets, I hand them that thing, and people show up with a ticket, they look at it, they scan it, they get people in, they enter. The things that we had to build, the things that we needed to do, initially we had to do camera because we're scanning QR codes. So that was a must-have. There's no way around that. We also need to be able to manually check people in. So we need to get a list of data, see who's been checked in, if they've been checked in or not, be able to scroll through that list, search through that list. As I learned after we shipped some of the early prototypes, some of these events can have as many as 10,000 people. I had been testing with 5. So that was neat. My search queries were not structured at all to handle anything that large. So I had to go back and refactor a lot to be able to handle 10,000 people. So we needed the camera to work. We needed to be able to make it pretty easy to touch. Their current app, the way that it worked, is that they would go to the API, pull down all of the data, and write it to a locally stored Postgres SQL database. Then all of the updates would happen to that SQL database, and once people were done, that data would then sync back up to the FreshTick servers to update what was online. It's a concert event, and you've got a ton of people coming through. Can you all kind of see where the problems are going to come in that? You're going to run into stale data. And so that was one of the biggest problems they had, is that frequently during the middle of an event, they were having people that would need to log out, clear their local device cache, which have anybody cleared your local device cache on an iOS device? It's not easy. At least it's not easy to me, and I use Android all the time, so that might be it, but it can tend to be a pain in the ass. So they had all these hoops that they had to jump through, and they said, what we really want is something that can be 100% pure API driven. Rather than pulling the data down once and then periodically syncing it and hoping that we have it right, let's just, pull the data down on demand. Now, I mentioned that we had the 10,000 user thing. That became really interesting. So we did have to find kind of a nice middle of the road, because that's a very large data set. We're bringing data in. It's pulling down all these usernames. The data coming from the API, we weren't rewriting the backend API, so the data coming from the API got to be a little interesting. I learned all kinds of fun new things about how to map your array requests, and also how to send paginated requests. These are things that Ionic, in my experience, made really, really easy to do. Because it's powered by Angular 4, at the end of the day, if Ionic didn't have a way to do it, there was an Angular way. And like most development, I could just Google Stack Overflow and find out what it is. I learned all about FlatMap. FlatMap is a really cool RxJS principle that allows you to go out, and what I was doing is grabbing chunks of data at a time. The API would support pagination. So I could say, give me 100 records for each page, and then if I knew that I was going to have, say, 10,000 records, I would just divide 10,000 by 100 and send that many requests. And then FlatMap would just take that, and every time I would get a promise back, when that promise would be fulfilled, I would write that to an array, and I could just gradually build this array of data, and it would do it sequentially. Now there's also ConcatMap, which would do it asynchronously, and so that would just fire up, and then as each request was filled, it would come back and populate and wouldn't do it in order. We chose to go with FlatMap to do it in order just because their server couldn't handle that many concurrent requests. Sometimes I would be sending a series of 30 requests. So what I would need to do is build in some timeouts, some fault tolerance, and throw one request at a time, and then render that out to the screen. Now what made this nice in Ionic is that Ionic has a built-in loader. So I would set this up, and while I'm listening for promises and I'm writing pure vanilla JavaScript, I'm kicking off a loader, and I'm saying, don't go away until that last promise is fulfilled. So we go to the page, they pull it up, they go, okay, cool. I got my list, the loader goes away, and they can start checking people in. Somebody comes up and they're not on that list, they just do a quick pull to refresh. I check the cache to see how old the cache is, and if you do a long enough pull, then I go out and I just grab all the data again. Fire it off, my little loading screen pops up. It's waiting. That final promise is fulfilled, the loading screen goes away, we've got fresh data again. The problem of stale data has gone away. All of this, the most difficult part was figuring out which RxJS method I wanted to use, which isn't a unique problem to native development. In my head, when I first sat down working on this, I was like, I have never built a native app at all, ever. I've done some progressive web apps. I've done a lot of just single page applications. So I understand sort of the core tenets of dealing with REST and how to pull data in and get data out and render all that stuff. But dealing with this on mobile, I wasn't really sure how to do it. Dealing with it in Ionic makes it really, really easy. They create an abstraction layer that even takes the Angular stuff. They can be messy. How many people have worked with Angular at all? Angular works great if you do everything the Angular way. Ionic is very much the same way. As a framework, it does all of these things really well if you do it the Ionic way. The nice thing is that you don't have as many weird variables and edge cases because you're doing it on Android or iOS. So a lot of the weird responsive stuff that I would worry about if I was opening this up in a web browser, didn't have a problem with. I was like, oh sweet, I can just load this up, I'm good to go. So that made it really nice. So going through, so the good and the bad, so like I said, the Ionic framework makes certain things, like I said, insanely easy. Now, we did have a few design things, and I'll fire it up in a second and show you what it looks like. We did have a few design things that didn't perfectly align with the UI patterns that are already part of Ionic. So those I had to get a little creative with, but it wasn't too hard. That's just HTML and CSS. And actually I was able to use Sass. It has Sass built right in. So I was able to just throw a bunch of Sass stuff in there. It does localize local scope CSS. How many people have worked with CSS modules? Anybody looked at that? If you're doing front-end work, CSS modules will change your life. I'm using them heavily in Vue. They are fantastic. What it does is it scopes all the CSS directly to the component in which you're working. So you don't have to worry about making a change to CSS somewhere and then the cascade filtering things down, and suddenly a style has changed drastically from what you had intended, because you're like, well, shit, I changed this thing here, I changed this button, and now it changed, I had unexpected consequences. CSS modules gets rid of that. Everything becomes locally scoped, and this handles all of that for you. You create your component. If you've worked with React and done any CSS and JS, you've seen some of this stuff. You can create your component, you create your CSS that goes with that component. When at compile time, when it builds all, everything is locally scoped. You know you build a button, that button's gonna look the same on every single page. And if you're working within their UI components, it's even easier, because all you can do, you change a few Sass variables with colors and stuff, and then it renders, and you're good to go. So that makes it really easy, and when you do have to branch out and create your own HTML and CSS components, it's not that hard. The docs are absolutely fantastic. I had never worked with TypeScript before. This actually made it not too bad. It made adjusting into TypeScript and strongly typed JavaScript not that bad to work with. And I had heard a lot of horror stories. I came from sort of the Wild West of PHP in the early JavaScript days. And I'm like, weak typed is fine because inference is going to save me everywhere. And then I started working in TypeScript, and I was like, and none of the inference works anymore. And boy, do I have a lot of really bad things that I need to change. Ionic was, it was kind of gently easing you into that. It wasn't too bad. And it even abstracted away some of the more annoying parts of Angular. The bad stuff, it almost does too much for you. There are times where it gets a little bit like a black box, and you're like, whoa, what is this doing? How is this working? I don't even really know what's going on behind the scenes, because it has abstracted that many things away that you're just throwing an Ionic component at something, and you're like, I don't even know how this is going to render. The build process can also be a pain in the ass. Paradoxically, the toughest build was building for iOS. Had to fire up Xcode. I had to do some self-signed certificates and had to change a few things. So the Android stuff, again, this may be a bias because I'm used to working on Android. The Android stuff was fairly straightforward. It's a manifest JSON file. If you've ever worked inside of a package JSON file, or you've ever done anything, Chrome apps, they use the same thing, a manifest JSON file. You set up your settings in there. Really straightforward. You can almost copy and paste from any example, and even the defaults that they give you. And your Android app will build to give you an APK. You can sideload that. So it made testing that stuff really easy. The areas where it does make things super simple. So I said we were using the barcode scanner. Thankfully, the plugin that I was using, it's a Cordova-based plugin. The plugin system that Ionic currently uses is based on Cordova. If you ever used the old PhoneGap, that was kind of one of the early things that started working with Cordova. I think Xamarin might use Cordova. I don't know. I haven't looked or touched or read about Xamarin in a long time, so I can't tell you for sure. There's a ton of Cordova plugins out there. It's really not unlike using jQuery, or like I had said earlier, some of the React ecosystem. You got a lot of people that have done a lot of the heavy lifting for you, so you can just plug these things in. However, it does get, if something were to go really wrong with that scanner, or if it would flat out fail. And one time I was doing something and I did the scan and it just kept causing the Android app to crash, and I couldn't figure out why. I still don't actually know what happened. I think it was something that was happening before the camera that was passing weird data back into the promise that the scanner was returning. So in those cases, that's where it's like, if you run into a serious problem or a serious crash, debugging that is going to be really difficult, because again, it abstracts so many of those things away. But flip side, it makes things really easy. After we ship the app, one of the things that they wanted to say, well, we don't want people to have to log out, so can we do a fingerprint scan? And just like you pop it into a lock screen, and then they take advantage of the fingerprint scanner, and that'll open up the app again for them. And that was pretty simple. It was literally just drop in this plugin that works with both Android and iOS. I drop it in, it gets a promise, it goes in, it looks at the fingerprint, the ID of the fingerprint, the unique ID that is on your phone. That's all it does. By the way, your fingerprint scanner, all it has is a record on your phone. So when you do it, it says, okay, well, this matches up, this hash matches, I've hashed your fingerprint. Then that process can unlock other things. So if you have like a fingerprint to log in, like if your banking app or if you use Mint fingerprint to log in, somewhere inside that app, they have your username and password credentials securely, hopefully securely stored, so that when you unlock it with your fingerprint and it has that hash match, it just goes in and pulls that data out of wherever that secure storage is. So I don't know that that's the case for every, like there may be something inside of a native app directly that I just am not unaware of, but for the most part, that's all it's doing is just simple hash matching. So doing that kind of stuff was really easy. When they came back and asked for these additional feature requests, things that seemed daunting before I started this project became really simple, because I was just like, oh, cool, let me just go see what's out there and track this down. Again, if anything had really broken, so there's our catch-22. Anytime you're messing with plugins, anybody that's used to jQuery has experienced this firsthand. You know, you build something, you go, oh, this works, and you drop a plugin in, and then everything goes to shit. And you're like, I don't know what just happened, and you're doing a whole lot of stack traces. Debugging mobile apps written in web technologies, really easy. I could hook up my phone over USB, connect it to my device, pull up Chrome, particularly in Android. Android was really easy. It's a little trickier in iOS, but still works. In iOS, you pull up Safari, go into your dev tools, and you can look up remote devices, and I could debug everything just like I was debugging an actual web page, the entire app. So typical, I'm a person that console logs everything. I should probably one day figure out how to make good use of stack trace so I can like put the pointers in there and everything else. But as it stands right now, I just put a shit ton of console log messages in there and like, I'll figure this out. And I did that in the app. So I would go through and just look for my console log messages if I was tracking something down or debugging something. And I was like, well, this is just like, absolutely just like building any other website. Made it really, really easy. So where is Ionic going next? So before I had worked on this project, I was working on a personal mobile app development, and I was looking at React Native because I was already doing some stuff in React, and I was like, I'll just move over with this. This is just React, what I already know. This project was contracted out through another company, a friend of mine that has an agency in Atlanta, and he was like, yo, do you want to build a mobile app? And I was like, yeah, that'd be fun. But he chose, like the framework was already chosen for me. They had one done in an early version of Ionic. They wanted this one, so I didn't get the choice in this one. It was just like, okay, well, I'll just learn it. The interesting thing when I started doing it, I was building an app. I was building this app in Ionic. I was doing the Hearst project in Vue, and I was writing an analytics app in React all at the same time, and teaching vanilla JavaScript. So I was kind of just weaving in and out of all kinds of different generalist JavaScript weirdness for a period of about 18 weeks. It's been nice to sort of just live in one world for a little while. But after the experience with it, I was like, I'm going to keep going with this. I actually like what it's doing. And while I was working on it, they announced Ionic 4. So Ionic 4, they want to make it framework agnostic. There's already some work that's been done. If you want to use Vue, if you've heard of Vue.js, it's kind of the hot new kid on the scene. Like I said, I'm using it, it's being used at Hearst, so that's where I was using it. But so there's already a port where you can use Ionic 3 with Vue. You don't actually have to use Angular. It does mean you're jumping through a few other hoops because it is kind of like they've got Ionic Angular built in and it makes things a lot easier. But if you really want to use Vue, you can. But with Ionic 4, they're actually going to be as completely framework agnostic as possible. And they're building Stencil, which they refer to as the magical reusable web component compiler. Stencil is going to be a lot like Polymer. If you've seen that, Google's Polymer project. It's just a group of polyfills that allow things to work cross-browser. So once the browser supports something natively as a web component, you will no longer even run that particular code. But until such time, you've got the polyfill and it'll run that code. Their goal is to end framework churn. I don't know if they came up with that, or I feel like that's something I've seen on Reddit. They're also working on providing more support for existing Cordova plugins and possibly creating sort of a premium subscription model for Cordova plugins. I'm thinking a lot like WordPress. That's my words to think like WordPress. That's my take on it. That's not necessarily theirs. They're also working on Capacitor, which is going to replace Cordova at some point. They want to create a new native runtime wrapper. I think Cordova is starting to show its age a little bit. Again, it's still very popular because of its plugin ecosystem, but eventually I think that's going to start to wane. And they're also doubling down on using progressive web apps and native. This is kind of happening across the board, and I think a lot of that also ties in with what's going on with Cordova. As people are moving more and more, as progressive web apps get more popular, in my mind, I want to say, as people are moving more and more towards progressive web apps, because that would be awesome. But I think there's just kind of a general move towards that. And not everything is being built 100% with native. I think some of these, the Cordova plugins are going to be too tightly tied to the way the Cordova does it. And so having another native runtime to be able to access that would be a lot easier. Yes?
Progressive?
Progressive. So do you guys know this progressive web apps? Does that make sense? I'm assuming no. Okay, cool. All right, so progressive web apps. The biggest thing that progressive web apps offer over your standard single page application is they don't necessarily have to be a single page application, but they also, the sort of massive game changer for them is the ability to use service workers. The easiest way to think of how service workers work and what they do is the one that's the most popular is offline. So imagine being able to go to a website, a web app, and using it like a native app, whether you're online or off.
So in other words, you're reinventing apps.
Probably. But yeah, so you're able to just sort of spin up and use Smashing Magazine. If you guys are familiar with that website, smashingmagazine.com. Smashing Magazine actually uses an offline service worker. So you go to the site once, it's going to pull down a bunch of data. If you went ahead and put your phone in airplane mode, you could still browse the site and run it like regular. Whereas any other site, if you go to it and you put your phone in airplane mode and try to reload it, you're going to get the happy little dinosaur. It's like, I don't have anything on this page. There's nothing there. So my biggest experience actually with PWAs was not in doing mobile development, but was working for Hearst, working on an application that would run on iPads to get test data. How many people read Car and Driver? So if you're a car guy or a car girl or you like cars, whatever, Car and Driver has a metric shit ton of data on every single car that they test. It's insane. They do things like ping pong ball tests where they will just bring in a ton of ping pong balls. I'm not kidding, it's probably literally a ton. And they will fill up trunks and back seats and storage. Like if you have a hatchback, they're gonna fill up the entire hatch with ping pong balls and count how many ping pong balls are filled in there, and they use it as a unit of measurement to determine how much trunk space there is, right? They do all of this stuff. Here's how they gather this data now. Somebody goes out with a pen and paper and they write down all of this stuff on pen and paper. Eventually, they go back to an office and they type most of it into a spreadsheet, which takes forever. And then that spreadsheet goes off to another person who then takes that information that's in the spreadsheet and copy and paste it into a CMS. That CMS then goes to the editor who writes the article using all the data that's been saved in this taxonomy. That's a whole lot of steps, and it's slow. Car and Driver does 14 million uniques a month because of the kind of data that they have on all these cars. The goal is get the data to the consumer much more quickly. In the days of magazines, it didn't matter so much because it takes a while to print a magazine. But in web, it's instantaneous. So Ford releases a new Mustang, they want to get that review out as quickly as possible. They can't wait on Joe Test Driver to get the stuff off of his notepad into the Excel spreadsheet that then gets emailed over to somebody else. So we were working on an application that would be a progressive web app that they would go in and basically we take all of that taxonomy that it ultimately needs to end up in, create a nice clean user interface for it. They walk out there with the iPad, they're checking off, this thing fit this many ping pong balls in the trunk. The tire pressure was this, the 0 to 60 was this was tested as this, the tint level was that, the radio did this. These are all, it was nuts, the different stuff that they test. I had no idea until I had to build the form that took in all that data. The reason we made it a progressive web app is instant updates. if you do a native application and you release it through the App Store, you have to wait on the App Store approval process to get that stuff out. If you do a progressive web app, you just push up the changes to your site. The next time you're online, all those changes are pushed down, your app is immediately updated. The other thing is, the places where they test some of these cars rarely have Wi-Fi, often don't have cell. They are in dead zones. So if we say, go to this website to enter all your data, and they go out there with an iPad and they walk into a dead zone and they're trying to type something, and suddenly they hit submit and the page refreshes and then it's gone, that's bad. And they're letting go of the iPad and they're picking up the pad and paper. But with the ability to do offline access and saving all of this stuff in an offline database that then can synchronize because of the nature of how the service worker works, we're telling them where they're saving it. They get back online, the app gets back online, says, hey, I'm back online. And then we've got functions in there that say, okay, take all the data that was saved while you're offline and synchronize that with online. So that's where progressive web apps. Now, the progressive part comes in that it's just going to behave like a regular website, like a regular web application. But if your browser supports service workers, if it supports offline access, different levels of this stuff, you can add those things in and progressively enhance your application, right? So it's just it'll work with what it works with, it'll work with what the browser gives it, and then it'll work even better in sort of the newer browsers and the newer situations. So you can kind of see that there's a little bit of the making the web apps more like native apps, but without having to jump through the hoops to do Swift and Java and all that stuff. So it's even taking sort of a step further with some of these frameworks. There are obviously any number of other different concerns. Responsiveness, for instance, becomes, I didn't write a single breakpoint for this application. I was like, nah, we're good. I built it on the smallest device, and the biggest device is going to get is the size of my Pixel XL. And as long as it worked on the iPod Touch, the Pixel XL didn't get big enough. I was never on a screen that was that much larger. So I didn't have to worry about any of that stuff. Didn't have to worry about cross-browser stuff. I was like, does it work in IE? I don't care. It doesn't have to work in IE. It has to work in whatever the web view is that is being used in Ionic, which currently they're in the process of switching over to WPK view, which is just another web view layer. Basically, it's a bundled version of Chrome that just loads and parses websites. So, all told, my experience, 1010 would totally use. Again, I actually have a personal app. The app I was going to build in React, I've actually started mapping it out and getting some prototyping done in Ionic because the time to development, I went from not having developed any code ever in Ionic with a little bit of Angular experience and having not touched mobile testing development at all to shipping this product. And we did it in about a 12-week window, and I was the only developer working on it. Granted, I had an API already in place that was quasi well documented. And by quasi, I mean that when we sent it off for testing, they would come back and go, hey, the other one used to do this. And then I could go back and untangle the old code. So that's my experience developing hybrid apps. I'm personally still, one of the main reasons why I'm liking what Ionic is doing is I love the idea of the stencil library and doing web components. And I like that they're putting their efforts into progressive web apps and native, and not just throwing all their eggs into the native basket. I'm a firm believer that the web is dominant. It's still winning. I know that the App Store is really popular and people are making a lot of money in the App Store, at least if you're selling expensive apps for Apple. Not necessarily so much through Android. But I believe that the open web is still the way to go, and releasing your applications to users through the web is the way to go. So that's another reason why, just philosophically, I like what Ionic is doing. All right, questions?
So the fingerprint stuff, it sounds like you had to do some sort of user management, or at least they had their own logins. Did you have to write any of that, or was it the API?
That was already handled in the API. And so what they do is when you log in, you get an API token in return. I just store that token. That token will eventually expire on the API side. So I'm storing that token locally in using a local storage API that Ionic provides. It's a little more robust than just the standard local storage one. And so what I do is when your fingerprint unlocks it, it then gives you access to check if that API token exists. I then run and see if that token has expired. If it has expired, we just bounce you back to the login screen. If it hasn't, then you're able to go about wherever you left off. We discussed possibly storing login credentials, so you could just flat out log in with your fingerprint, but the local storage is good enough for the API token. It's not, I don't know that I'd feel 100% comfortable storing someone's user credentials on it. Glenn.
Is there anything you can do with like native development that you can't with something like that, with Ionic?
Probably. I know there are some things, like for instance, talking about the fingerprint stuff, if I had to guess, I'm thinking that just writing your native code, you can do a lot more with what is stored along with the fingerprint. Like you're going to have access to parts of the operating system that you don't normally have access to when you're going through sort of a browser-based runtime. So I think there are probably a few things you can get. The camera stuff is fairly rudimentary, right? Like I wouldn't try to actually write a new camera app or do a lot of photo editing kind of stuff with it. You could do some basic, anything you could do in any like the aviary apps, right, that run the browser, you could do that kind of stuff. But anytime you're running through that browser runtime, it's also going to be a little bit of a memory overhead. So anything that's going to do a lot of heavy processing is going to be much faster in native because that's closer to bare metal. But for most applications, you know, if you're just passing data back and forth or checking data, and in this case with FreshTix, everything was as a GET request. Even when I'm scanning tickets to see if it's valid and recording that someone has entered the show, right? So you have a multi-day festival and you want to track that they entered on Saturday and they entered on Sunday, and you want to make sure that you're letting them in. When they show up on Sunday, you want to make sure that you let them in, but also you want to make sure that they haven't duplicated the ticket and given it to somebody else, so you inadvertently scan that ticket 2 times and one of them is counterfeit on Saturday. That stuff was still, I didn't have to do a single post or a put. I was just doing GETs. The API was still able to record that data. So that, in that case, it was even easier because we had a really solid API in the background.
I have one question. Do you think the Ionic, what I see mostly is dedicated to the enterprise level applications with a specific set of users. But can this be expanded to users like, suppose for an application online, which multiple users can use and you have no data regarding it?
That you're not saving any data,
Yeah.
or?
Because the progressive web apps, as I've understood from what you have told me, regarding that is you have a direct update without getting approval from the App Store and from the Android store, right?
Right, correct.
So in that case, if the export is not binded to the App Store, the URL is not registered with the App Store,
Correct.
right?
Yeah, the App Store is totally out of the equation.
So in that case, don't you think that it would cause a security issue to that specific URL? Because when you're launching it to multiple users across the globe.
No more so than any other web application, right? So if I'm understanding correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're going to have the same security issues that you would have. So you're saying that because you're not getting vetted by the app stores, you can't guarantee, like my app doesn't have any viruses.
No, it's not with the viruses, it's with the data mapping or the URL spoofing.
Right. In this case, it's going to be just like if you were, if somebody could easily go and spoof Facebook right now and, and set up a login if you were you think you're going to facebook.com and you go to something else, right? So like phishing attacks and that kind of stuff is going to be just so, and that same standard would apply here. So you don't get this extra level of protection, right? You don't get to say you've got the badge that, hey, we've been vetted by the App Store, Google and Apple says that we're okay. So you don't get that layer, but you wouldn't get that with any other web application anyway. So I think it's up to, ultimately, I think it's just a personal choice, like whatever you're most comfortable with. I'm going to be using, just talking about for using it outside, the app that I'm developing is a theme park tracker. So this is going to be used kind of definitely not in an enterprise environment. It's literally so I can keep track of how many times I rode Space Mountain at Walt Disney World. All it's going to be doing is tracking my geo data, and whenever I walk within the geo, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, geofence. The geofenced area of where Space Mountain is going to be like, okay, he wrote it again. Okay, he wrote it again. I can pull it up and see. So, and yeah, obviously in that instance, there's concern that someone might be hijacking my data want to make sure you're serving your stuff over HTTPS and try not to serve any, save any sensitive data in any way that you wouldn't want it, that would be vulnerable and that kind of thing. But yeah, I think there's a total non-enterprise use as well. And again, it makes it really easy, so I don't have to worry about waiting. Like, oh shit, I didn't get it up into the App Store in time before my next trip to Disney, which we've never met, but I go to Disney a lot. So, anything else?
Have you ever used one of the alternative hybrid frameworks to have the comparison?
I started working in React Native. I can't give it a fair comparison to this, only because I was still brand new to React as well. So what I don't know is, were the things that I didn't like about it React things, or was it working on native platform things? Ionic did make the native stuff stupid kinds of easy. It was literally jQuery plugin style easy, which is both awesome and a little scary, because you do want to make sure that your plugins are vetted. Ionic does a good job of, they have plugins that they have endorsed. And part of what they want to do with that Cordova plugin support is go further with that and find the best plugins that are out there and provide financial support to those people, financial incentives for people to develop more plugins, so that you aren't just kind of randomly going to GitHub and just searching for whatever plugin. However, if you've ever used NPM, we're all guilty of just going, oh, what's the coolest plugin for this in NPM? And I hope that it works. Hasn't been touched in a year. I've installed 2 or 3 of those. Don't tell anyone. Anything else? Cool. Well, we still have sandwiches, so go get some food. Christian, I'm glad you made it. Of course there's not. It's Athens. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Christian Turner. He just moved to Athens from Atlanta. He and I used to work together, and I talked about Athens so much, he said, I'm just going to move there. It sounds great. If you're hiring, you should talk to Christian. He's an up-and-coming junior developer who's kicking ass with React right now. So, hey, I'm going to put you on the spot. Is that all right? Yeah. Okay. You're welcome. All right. Thank y'all. Oh, shit. Do you want to see what it looks like in the browser?
Yes.
That would probably be neat, right? I'm just going to talk about an app and not show it to anyone. So Ionic has a really good CLI as well. So actually, this is one of the things I probably should have put on a slide. So when you're building, if you build a single page application, there's a particular folder and file structure that you need to build for each file, like when you're building React components and stuff. Ionic has this great thing where it actually has a generate command. So you can type Ionic generate page and you give it a page name. All those files are created for you with the base syntax already there, and you just go in and start adding all the customizations. It was the easiest thing in the world. I wish every CLI had that. As I'm working with Create React App right now, and I wish that there was a command in that where I could just be like, create this component structure, and it would just be like, boom, done, and I don't have to just keep copying and pasting stuff. Serving it up on Android, you could type, oh, something broke. Oh, hell. Hold on. See if the develop branch works. So, where this is breaking, if you look, remember I said that running it on iOS and building for iOS was a pain in the ass? So I'm running into an issue with Node.js. I know. NPM rebuild. Live coding, ladies and gentlemen.
I can just edit this out.
That's fine. This is, so when I taught, I quickly learned after the first quarter, don't live code in front of the students. And I just started writing out every application first and then copying it and stripping out the final product and showing them the start and the finish and then gradually walking them through because inevitably something was going to go wonky and break. So so Ionic, when I was testing it on my device, I would hook up my phone, enable USB debugging on Android, pretty simple developer options. Hook it up over USB, type Ionic Cordova run Android, and it would just run and write right to the Android device. So you can see this runs just like a regular website. I lived in this view for the longest time. I've been working on developing with just one monitor for a while, so I can do more work on my couch while I'm watching television, because I'm lazy. And being able to work on the mobile app was great because it was the only time my developer tools didn't sit over most of the interface that I needed to test. I was like, oh, okay, cool. I can just do that, so that's awesome. This whole login, the floating label and everything, that is all handled by Ionic. So that matches the Google Material Design Guidelines right out of the box. And it also does the same for iOS. I didn't have to program any of that. I've written so many websites with floating labels, and I know how to do it, and I was glad I didn't have to. I just dropped an Ion label in there, and that as that element, it worked right out of the box. It was glorious.
There is one other system I was thinking of asking you about, but I doubt anybody else here has a parenthesis detection.
Yeah, no. All right, so this just made, and you can watch in my network tab, I just went ahead and I hit my sign-in endpoint. I went ahead and grabbed my events based on the token. So this is all just regular JSON data that's being returned. This lets me see, this is a, not chart.js, I ended up shifting to D3. This is D3.js for rendering that. That's just a regular thing. There's an Ion, or an Ionic version of it that was able to drop right in place. This is all just done with regular REST. This was something that they wanted, so you might have a device that is scanning only at the VIP section. And so you don't want them to be able to scan any general admission or any designated driver tickets. And so what you can do is before they hand out these, and iPod Touches are cheap, right? So they just log in with the account, they go in and they switch all these off. Now that can be changed on the fly. It's not super secure, they're not concerned about it. Most people don't bother to go in, but then they set which tickets can be scanned. And that's gonna apply not only to what can be scanned, but what you can do with the manual check-in. And so you can come in here, and if this general admission is not allowed to be checked in, so say I go here, go back to the list, and I disable all general admissions. I come in here, and you can see over here, all it's doing, these are all my network calls. Just standard calls, waiting on promises to be returned. I'm gonna try to check this person in, and it's gonna throw this message. That alert is an Ionic alert. I could change the color of it and I could add custom text to it, but all I'm doing is passing data into that component that already exists, giving it a class with a class name and telling it what to do. The close is already there, the behavior is already there. Again, on Android matches Material Design Guidelines, on iOS it matches Apple's design guidelines. All of that is handled behind the scenes by Ionic. I didn't have to write any of that. The classes are added dynamically. If we have a user that is checked in, I can go and check them out. And same thing, using the exact same component, just passing some different variables to it, different properties, and it spits back all of that stuff. The tricky parts of doing this, I can't test the barcode scanner. It won't go to the camera, it's gonna go right to the device. The Cordova plugin will say I'm not on an actual mobile device. So I can't test that. That has to be tested on a live device. Pull to refresh has to be tested on a live device. There's not a way to emulate the actual pull to refresh on that you can do on a device inside the browser. So there are limitations to what you can do with the testing, but for the basic stuff, what I ended up doing to test the barcode scanner is I would just inject a button here that would send the data that I needed to, that would just trigger an actual barcode that I knew worked. I would hit that, and then it would call the barcode function with the necessary data so that I could test it before firing it up and running on my device. Just because every time it runs through the build and pushes it out, it just takes a little bit of time. So if I was trying to save time, I would just put a few cheats in there. So the menu, standard menu, you just go in, you drop in the icon and say, hey, trigger the menu, trigger the logout. That alert, again, is a regular alert. You just say, hey, pop this up, and based on what I hit here, either cancel or log out. It's like any other modal response window that you would do in regular JavaScript. And the routing through the different pages as you go into the events. You're not actually seeing the changes in the URL, but it is doing standard routing. So somewhere behind here, well, you can see it here because I'm testing in the browser. In the app, you don't actually see this, but you can see where the routes have been structured, and I'm passing dynamic routing just like you would through any other single page application.
Can we see how many console logs you have?
I don't think I have any. What? Yeah, no, I took them all out. I was glad. I mean, we get the errors, the Angular running in develop mode, and that it tried to run something in native that you can't because it's in the browser. But yeah, I was able to get most of my console logs out of there. So yeah, so that's what it looks like. And when I fired it up on my phone, it pretty much exactly the same. So there we go. If you're looking at doing any sort of mobile development, you need to test a proof of concept, I would highly recommend it. There's a bunch of starter kits out there. We started with the Super Starter. It's just, you can go to, just search for Ionic Super Starter. There's a Git repo. You clone the repo, spin it up, do your npm install, and you're good to go. And it'll actually give you some basics. All of the Git and the fetch requests that happen, all the HTTP requests, were actually, I just took the basic function that the starter kit had already in it and just modified it to meet whatever needs I had. So it took a lot of the sort of the basic heavy lifting, the tedious garbage that you got to do every time you spin up an application. It took that right out of the equation and made it really simple. So there we go. 1010 would definitely use again. And if you want to trust the guy that walks around with a Power Ranger sword, that's on you. Thank y'all very much.